Hello there and welcome to a new video. I shall continue my SCP tier list. Let's go. SCP-423, the self-inserting character. A conceptual entity which inserts itself as a side character in many forms of media, especially written literature, or exclusively literature. I would put Fred in C tier. It's a very interesting concept, executed fairly well for an Series 1 SCP. The only problem I have with SCP-423 is that he just inserts himself in a story and then kind of chills there. And that's literally it. That's the entire concept of this SCP. And the collaborative experiment log, although I appreciate it, it is one of those collaborative logs which I simply don't care for because you can't really do much with SCP-423. He inserts himself, chills there as a side character, but doesn't really contribute to the overall story. And that's kinda it. But I like him because he's a charming little character, executed fairly well. SCP-426. I am a toaster. Now this is an interesting one. One of the most funniest SCPs I have ever read, aside from some -J SCPs. I will put him in A. It's pretty funny that those who talk about SCP-423 don't even realize that they are referring to SCP-423 in the first person, which definitely caught me off guard, and it was a nice change from all the horrific SCPs. Although SCP-426 is one of those lethal SCPs, but in a pretty funny way. People around it who stay around SCP-426 will gradually think that they are a toaster and try to become a toaster, but it doesn't really work and they die off. And when I first read this SCP, I was definitely caught off guard when I read the description of it. How the Foundation referred to SCP-426 in the first person. Definitely caught me off guard. The Lovecraftian Locket. A locket that heals you and then slowly turns you into a slime monster, yeah. It's an F tier for me. I like how it's the result of an experiment of a cross test between SCP-500 Panacea and SCP-914 of the Clockworks, but that's the only thing that it has going for it, that it is a result of an experiment. But that's it. Otherwise, it's a very benign object. Just don't worry and then you'll be fine. And slime monsters, nothing too special. The Bone Hive. Definitely one of the most horrific because they just reproduce, build this entire nest, this entire hive to create a little animal kingdom, and then they all just die off only for one survivor to be left, and the entire process starts to repeat itself again. It's like, why would you do that? And why would you keep the human alive somehow? I don't know how they do it, but they can't do it. They turn their prey, the victim, into a living bone hive. And they are fully aware of everything that is going on. They can feel every little insect crawling on them, every little bone growth, every single bit of pain. They are fully aware of it and cannot move, cannot talk, cannot scream. It's very horrific. It's either an A or S tier. I put an S tier because the concept is executed very well and the reveal at the end simply gruesome. Now this ball of green slime. The quirk about this SCP is that it does something very, very horrific to dead bodies, but we don't actually get to know what it does to dead bodies. In about every paragraph, there's at least one sentence which says, don't let this slime come into contact with dead bodies, every single paragraph, which is definitely unique, but that's everything that SCP-447 has going for it, because without it, it would be just a sphere that exudes a green slime which tastes minty and creates and refines stuff. A little bit like 914, but you should not let it come into contact with dead bodies. And it definitely wears off over time, and the fact that we never get to know what it does to dead bodies is mysterious, but doesn't help it. Doesn't help its case. The Scripted Nightclub. One of those SCPs which I have read, but it was so forgettable. I can't care for it. I simply don't care for it. It's an E tier. Nothing that astounded me. Nothing that impressed me. The Burning Man. Now this is interesting. I like how its intelligence grows by size. And I like how it just becomes smarter and bigger and essentially more dangerous the more it consumes and spreads. And it consumes and spreads a lot because it is an entity made out of pure flame fire. So when it reaches containment and if it spreads uncontrollably, it's a big breach of security. I will put the Burning Man in. It's a C tier. I like the concept. It's executed fairly well for Series 1 SCP, but nothing more is done with SCP-457. It just exists and chills there, and when it breaches containment, fire extinguishers and water hose come and try to extinguish SCP-457, or at least lure it back into its containment chamber. And that's really it. Panacea. I hate this SCP. It's very famous, but I simply can't. I can't deal with this SCP. It's just magic pills which cure you, and that's essentially everything that it does. No bigger story, no interesting project on how the Foundation might want to replicate SCP-500, no incident log where some other group of interest tries to obtain SCP-500. Those are just all curing pills which exist and do nothing. It's interesting how there's only a limited amount of them, but that doesn't save this SCP from going into F tier. It's a prescription. It's a pill bottle with magic pills, and that's it. And there's only a limited amount of them. SCP-504. Oh god. One of the most humorous SCPs alongside SCP-426. It's an S tier. It's definitely an S tier because I love how the tomatoes are actually intelligent, are actually sentient, and the various and quirky interactions they had with some of the D-class personnel who told for jokes around them. I chuckled at every little sentence, every single sentence in that file. It was genuinely very, very funny. The Dimension Hopper. The reluctant Dimension Hopper, to be exact. You just feel sorry for this guy. He can't really do anything. He just hops through dimensions. But it is pretty impressive how he's still alive despite him just hopping into different dimensions without any will, reason, or warning. The concept itself is okay, but the exploration log or whatever it is definitely saves this SCP, where all the different dimensions are transcribed, which SCP-507 has traveled to, and the last incident log where two SCP-507s from two different dimensions hopped into a third dimension, and the SCP Foundation tried to figure out which one of them was originating from the third dimension, and apparently none of them were. They were trying to convince the Foundation they were from this universe, but they simply fucked up because of differences in historical events, and then both SCP-507 instances were terminated, and the third SCP-507 originating from the third dimension returned, and It definitely was pretty interesting. SCP-513, a cowbell. One of the most classic SCPs is Spooky Cowbell, which spawns a spooky man and which will eventually make you insane and kill you. It's an E-tier. It's one of those spooky objects which does spooky things, and the only thing that it excels at is it is actually kind of spooky. It's very short and sweet. Short and sweet horror SCP. Oh, the omnivorous rabbit. It's a little rabbit which can eat literally anything without any adverse effects, which is pretty funny, but I don't want to put it in F tier because it is a cute SCP, and I kind of like the core concept. It's a bunny which eats everything and behaves like a normal bunny, no physical abnormalities, it just chills and eats everything. Even 682 is scared of it. Isn't that lovely? Mr. Fish. One of the best little misters I have ever seen. He is just a regular, normal guy with a fish head. I like the humor associated with SCP-527. It's so basic yet effective. One of the better little misters. Josie the Half Cat, F tier. I couldn't care less about this cat, which is essentially cut in half, and its lower back is not invisible, it's simply not there, it's intangible. What could have been done with this concept? It's a very early SCP, one of the earliest SCPs ever written, and therefore it doesn't have that much story going for it. It's just an object / entity which does something. As most Series 1 SCPs are, not a lot of lore or story or incidents are involved with this SCP because it was so early written. And you can see it with SCP-529, but it has aged fairly well. I can understand why some people might enjoy it, and SCP-529 is definitely a little bit cute. The Katana of Apparent Invincibility. A sword, when you pick it up, you think that you are invincible, but you are the clumsiest. But in actuality, you are the clumsiest person in the universe while holding SCP-592? 572. It definitely made me chuckle. But nothing more is done with it. It's an E tier. It definitely is a nice joke, but it just exists. And that's it. Now this one. I can understand why people would laugh at this SCP. But when I read it, I didn't care. I didn't laugh a single bit. I found it pretty quirky that the file was a little bit corrupted. With a lot of grammar issues, misspellings and all that stuff. But this guy, F tier. The humor didn't strike me. 610, The Flesh That Hates, one of the best Series 1 SCPs. How horrific it is, a bodily horror. Gruesome, lore with sarcasm. Even though the Sarkic cults weren't even a thing yet at the time this SCP was written. And the original author claims that it is completely separate from the Sarkic cults, but come on. This is the blood of Yaldabaoth or something associated with Yaldabaoth and Sarkic lore. The exploration logs are pretty horrific, very gruesome and disgusting imagery, oftentimes associated with SCP-610, The Flesh That Hates. The last experiment log is Expunge, which definitely brings it down, but it still is deserving of S tier. It's so well written, aged so well, the imagery that you form in your head while reading the complete file. It's so gruesome, horrific, and disgusting that you want to throw up, but you want to keep going because it's so interesting and you want to know more. And if you are very invested in Sarkic lore, which I am myself not really interested in, you gotta know this SCP, and you have to love SCP-610 for what it did and for what it represents. SCP-650, the Starling statue. Like SCP-173, but it isn't actually harmful. It's actually quite a wholesome SCP. It tries to be threatening, but It just wants to scare people. That's everything that it wants to do. But it's an FD for me because not a lot of stories is associated with SCP-650. And the anomalous effect that it has is rather benign. And something that we have seen before, statues that don't move while you're not looking at them. The most notable examples being SCP-173, SCP-689, and SCP-650, the Starling statue, brings something new on the table by being not lethal, for once, but it's F tier. It's nothing special. The Butler's Handbell. When I get asked the question which SCP I want to have in real life, I almost always answer SCP-662, because who doesn't want SCP-662? Mr. Deeds, one of the best and memorable characters in SCP lore. Everybody knows about the Butler's Handbell, how useful it actually is, and how much you want it to be real, and how much you want to hold it in your hands. It's a B tier. But the interviews between the Doctor and Mr. Deeds is nothing quite special, but it shows off SCP-662's enormous properties, specifically Mr. Deeds. And he's a cool individual. It's a C tier. I think that he simply doesn't compare that well compared to other SCPs in B tier. But C tier is still good. It's an average. Oh boy. The damned lizard. The mutating gecko himself. You know? At first, I wasn't a really big fan of SCP-682 because it was your typical Marisu which couldn't be killed, and everybody sort of talked about this SCP, and you heard enough of that SCP. You simply heard enough of that SCP. But when I really got invested in, when I really read into SCP-682's lore and what the things that he survived and how he survived and the various adaptations that SCP-682 has come up with, it's an S tier for me. The original file isn't that interesting. It's an F tier. If we base SCP-682 just on its file, it's an F tier for me. But the experiment log, the collaborative experiment log, this is where SCP-682 shines the most, and that saves SCP-682. SCP-682 isn't just some immortal, indestructible entity which just survives everything. It's known for its adaptation abilities and that it simply cannot be killed. What if there was an entity which couldn't be killed whatsoever? Why the hell not? And that entity is SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile. And then when you realize that SCP-682's adaptation ability isn't like a passive effect, that it is actually connected with SCP-682's own mind. So that implies that SCP-682 has to think of its adaptations before they kick in. Like, what the hell? SCP-682 is some omniscient entity. It just has god-level intelligence. You can't kill it. Just stop trying it. Why does the Foundation even try to destroy SCP-682? Just keep it in hydrochloric acid and leave it be. And also, a little fun fact, it has been confirmed by the original author of SCP-682, Dr. Gears, that the hydrochloric acid is effective, not because it actually damages SCP-682, but because SCP-682 treats the hydrochloric acid as a warm bath. So SCP-682 is kinda willingly contained and just chills there because it is either waiting for SCP-079, the old AI, which it is friends with, or it waits for SCP-053 to finally mature. So that's something very interesting to think about, and this makes SCP-682 completely unstoppable. If it weren't for 079 or 053, 682 would have destroyed the entire multiverse by now. But it is patient, it is intelligent, it is a brute, it is indestructible, it cannot be killed. and is one of the classic SCPs. If SCP-173 were to be removed, I think SCP-682, the Hard to Destroy Reptile, would become the new mascot for the SCP Wiki, alongside 049, 096, 106, and some of the others. The Hanged King's Tragedy, SCP-701. A gruesome play which by itself is just a play which just kills people, but when you really get into the lore of the Hanged King, you have to appreciate what this SCP built up for. This SCP laid the foundation for so many interesting niches, so many interesting lore aspects within the SCP universe. SCP-701, you have to appreciate it and what it has done. The Hanged King, one of my favorite things, lore aspects of the SCP verse. It's an A tier. I think it's more of a. Come to think of it, it's more of a C tier, because the original SCP-701 is just a play which drew some stuff to people with each other, and body horror and death, as most Series 1 SCPs are deadly, and SCP-701 is no exception. But it created a lot of lore. Without it, there would be no Hanged King lore. Now, the fanfic plague. A weird mimetic effect or conceptual entity which just affects every copy of itself and screws it completely up into some weird fan fiction, not only its own file, but also our forms of literature and media. Don't let this SCP come into a library, it's going to corrupt the whole thing. It's definitely funny, but it's very over the top and just slaps the funny parts into your face, which isn't really that great, because I am more of a person who likes SCPs who are subtly inserting information into you without stating it directly. And the funny parts are just thrown into your face, diminishing the funny factor of them. It's like yelling to a person, "Look, this part is pretty funny, now laugh or die." Versus SCP-732. But it is a rather interesting concept, but a concept which I cannot care less for. The Devil's Deal, SCP-738. The writing isn't that astounding, but that is acceptable, because it's one of the most earliest SCPs written, SCP-738. And the core concept and the execution, it accelerates at that. For Series 1 SCPs, one of the better ones. Definitely one of the gems of Series 1. A little furniture which summons a demon, which will make your wish come true, but you have to repay the demon in order for the wish to come true. And it has to be of equal value, whatever this may entail. And I do like the experiment log. It was pretty humorous at times. World Without Man, SCP-804. It's an object which destroys stuff, makes them decay, and from what I can remember, accelerates time. So structural integrity will be degraded. Humans age faster and then die off. Cells and all that stuff. It's one of those. It's just another XK class object. It is very interesting and at how it wants to destroy the world, but in the end, it's just another being / object which wants to destroy the world because everybody hates humans. The Swamp Woman. Pretty wholesome SCP. And for once, not deadly. It's a D tier. I like the implication that it was once a human, but now it is this Swamp Woman having been turned by Herman Fuller's Circus of a Disquieting, the theories regarding SCP-811. She is alright. A humanoid SCP which is wholesome, does stuff, exists, and a shroud of mystery surrounding SCP-811, which definitely helps it. The next one, SCP-823, The Carnival of Horrors, a place which when you are there, you will most likely die in a horrific way, and SCP-823 is physically expanding. Weren't it for the expanding part, it would be just another spooky location, but I like how SCP-823 expands, which definitely isn't great. But on the other hand, it's just a spooky location, and for many Series 1 spooky locations, the next possible thing that you can expect is that the area of effect is just going to expand. Just like with SCP-354, the Blood Pond / the Red Pool. At its climax, it just tries to expand. And that's it. But I do love it. I don't know, it's a detail. It deserves a detail. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it while reading it. I like the concept and the execution. SCP-835. The sudden realization that the corals are not actually corals, but biological tissue, and especially live human subjects who have been infected with SCP-835 it's an S tier. The exploration log, the little love story going on, although unexpected, did kind of work out. And it gets an S tier. It gets an S tier. Oh god. Cake which duplicates itself. We are all going to die by cave. Have fun with that, Fog. One of the most ridiculous SCPs. It's just another XK class SCP, but its concept and execution is so great, so funny, so ridiculous for a Series 1 SCP. It's an A tier. It doesn't deserve S. Does it deserve S tier? It's one of the SCPs which it's one of the first SCPs I've ever read about, and it's still very, very memorable. Every time I see this iconic picture of this cake, I just have to think of SCP-871 and how it's going to erase all life in the universe eventually, maybe, I don't know. Just don't let it come into contact with the vacuum of space, because that's going to fuck a lot of shit up. SCP-882 A Machine. S tier. Possibly the corrupted heart of a broken god, maybe created by the GOI, the factory. I like what it does. The writing is pretty quirky, not that great, and the clinical tone of SCP-882 isn't very well maintained, but it is understandable because it's a very early SCP. But its associations with the Church of a Broken God, and then the addendum where we get where we get an interview with one of the cultists which worshipped SCP-882 because SCP-882 has this kind of effect. It's great. It's great. 884. The Shaving Mirror, or A Shaving Mirror. I like how the Chaos Insurgency is portrayed as a very intelligent and not to be played with GUI. And because of that, it's a detail. I don't really care for the object itself nor its effects. I just like the Chaos Insurgency aspect of SCP-884, which is like its core concept, the core idea. SCP-890, the Rocket Surgeon, a human which can interact with machines as if they were normal human beings, and interacts with them as such. Like he's talking to machines and operating them like a doctor and dissecting them, treating them like real patients. It was definitely kind of weird when I first read it, and I didn't fully get it. But then I reread it and I realized it's a pretty cool concept, and the execution is pretty great and definitely pretty funny, because some of the dialogue that he has with some of the random machines and objects, pretty ridiculous stuff for an outside observer, of course. SCP-895, Camera Disruption. One of those SCPs which are not very interesting by themselves, but have become popular because of that one gimmick that they have. And in SCP-895's case, it's the gimmick with the video camera. How it just shows various horrific images, and how it actually displays the current time and date of the location you are currently in real life. Pretty spooky, but it's a pretty iconic SCP. Every time I see a coffin, I have to think of SCP-895, and I like how the HQ is actually suffering in the incident log and not the mobile task force, because we have a lot of instances where the mobile task force gets in, dies, while command center's just chilling, vibing, completely clueless of what had happened. It's nice to see a command center to experience some of that pain, even though they didn't fully deserve this. But hey, it's the SCP world. Who the hell cares? I'm content to put in an F tier though. The only thing that it has going is the video quirk that it has. An E tier. I like the design of SCP-895. It's very eerie, and although it's just a normal coffin, it achieves its goal at being very scary. 902, the final countdown. Bad concept, bad execution, and bad writing. Everything combined, F tier. 914, the Clockworks. The most popular machine-related SCP. I have to give it a D. I like the experiment log. I love how iconic this SCP is. I love what SCP-914 is capable of, but when you look at SCP-914 again, it's just a machine which kind of exists. We don't know its origins. We don't know how it was recovered. Or maybe do we know? Anyway, it's not very memorable on how it was recovered, and not many story aspects are tied to SCP-914. It just exists, and people just want to experiment with it. And you just want to see what is going to come out on the other side of SCP-914. It just sparks the curiosity of every human. And I appreciate it for it. SCP-939, with many voices. Great writing, one of those Series 1 gems. I genuinely find SCP-939 instances scary because they're just built different. They're just built to perfectly lure in, fool, and hunt humans. That's literally their nature. That's what they were created for. That's what they were born for. Hunt humans for literally no reason whatsoever, because they biologically don't even need to feed. But they do so because nature, and they're cruel, and the aspect that some of them were once normal human children and then turned into SCP-939 instances. How they can crawl, how when you get bitten by them you forget that they exist, and maybe you will return to them because, I don't know, déjà vu. And how they mimic voices, it's so iconic. S tier. Dr. Jack Bright, Immortality, SCP-963. It's a C tier. An indestructible amulet with the soul of Dr. Jack Bright within it, and he possesses humanoid bodies, or in general, any form of bodies that comes into contact with the amulet. I do love how Dr. Jack Bright's soul ended up in SCP-963. It's definitely a very interesting story aspect, and the character of Dr. Jack Bright himself is so iconic. You can never go wrong with a good old Dr. Bright story where he's going to fuck shit up. But anyways, SCP-966, the Sleep Killers. They kind of exist and do stuff. They're very reminiscent of Freddy Krueger. But instead of instead of putting yourself to sleep to activate SCP-966's effects, they prevent you from sleeping, and then they deprive you, and then they attack you, and then you die off, and that's it. Very kind of reminiscent of Freddy Krueger, not only because of their effects, but also because, well, Freddy Krueger doesn't really prevent you from sleeping. He wants you to sleep and then kills you in his sleep. Just forget what I said about Freddy Krueger and SCP-966. Is one of those predatory SCPs, a species of malicious entities which hunt you in a very, very horrific manner and kill you because they can, but in this time they actually need to kill you because they have a biological need to feed. They just exist, they just vibe, and that's it. Now this is interesting. I love other dimensions. I love this SCP. It's very mind-screwy, but it does what it wants to do well. It's a detail. The Dream Man, one of the earliest SCPs I've ever read about. I always love people who are from the future, in stories of course, who are from the future and tell about the future in cryptic ways. And SCP-990 definitely opens a lot of story ways, paths, and aspects which can be explored, which are there to further heighten the stakes of the story. If you include SCP-990, I love SCP-990. I simply love the concept of him. I simply love his character. Bobble the Clown. I don't care for you. You're not even scary. You just exist. And traumatizing, but I like how you I like how you turn harmless, innocent little children into serial killers, or maybe even something worse. I don't know. Why do you do that? I don't know. Because you can, I guess. SCP-999, the Tickle Monster. I'ma be honest, F tier. I appreciated that it is a very cute, very happy, benign, and overall an SCP you just want to pet. But the file itself is so outdated, it's so badly written. You can smell the bad writing. You can simply smell it. It's one of the earliest SCPs, therefore the quality isn't that great. I'm going to heighten it for because lore. That's all I'm going to say with about SCP-999. Lore. The forest that shall not be named. I like its ties with SCP-001, Dr. Bryce's proposal. I love the Fae. I love every single lore aspect of the Fae. I love how the file is written. I like the enormous properties that SCP-4000 has. It deserves an S tier. It's so well written. The concept and the execution is great, and how much it contributes to the lore founded during the times of the Factory SCP, expanded on it. It's beautiful. Alexandria's Library, or Alexandria Eternal. That's the nickname for SCP-4001. Doesn't really interest me. We have an infinite library with all forms of information already, and that is the Wanderer's Library. And SCP-4001 and the Wanderer's Library are separate beings / locations. I like how you can rewrite the fate of stuff, but it doesn't really interest me. It's a big library with a lot of information, very ancient, and if you write in a book or edit a book, history, space, and time will change accordingly, retroactively erasing stuff, but nothing more is done with it. That's essentially everything that SCP-4001 has to offer. In the eyes of the beholder, I love the twist. I simply love the twist. The core anomaly itself isn't very interesting. A pair of mimetic eyes, which when you stare at them, you die. But the story associated with SCP-4205, The twist at the end, the reveal, beautiful. One of the most comical SCPs. How much have I said that in this video? Anyway, SCP-4444, Bush versus Gore. Was that the nickname of SCP? I can't really remember. Dr. Bright becomes president, gets elected as president. Isn't that a beautiful thought? 8 here. The Yule Man. One of the most horrific, gruesome, and just most malicious SCPs that I've ever seen. With the only SCPs more evil than SCP-466 being SCP-106 and SCP-3999. Why the hell does it do that to children? Why don't you just leave them alone? It's just like, Krampus, I think that was the name, but completely amplified in so many horrific ways. And the final interview log and the final sentence that the victim says, very chilling, very memorable. If you can't make toys, you become the toys. That's just that's SCP-466's quirk. Very horrific, very memorable. Oh no, and a hentai SCP. Isn't that beautiful? Although I don't really care for the core anomaly itself, I like how the Foundation tried to appease it. And then the lore associated with it, and how it builds upon the and how SCP-4960 builds upon the lore established in SCP-001 Dr. Clef's proposal, the Gate Guardian. It's beautiful. This SCP was written by the same author of SCP-001 Dr. Clef's proposal, who would be Dr. Clef. And it was, and you can tell it's written by Dr. Clef. It has his charm. It definitely carries over to SCP-4960. Now this one, a very horrific insect story. It's an S tier. I was kind of on edge while reading it, because you genuinely felt sorry and scared for all of these individuals. They were just normal those victims were very relatable because they were just average Joes, normal humans using social media, and then suddenly a catastrophe awaits them, and they just slowly but surely die off because of malicious insects who want to destroy all humans, all life on Earth, because everybody hates humans, life, and Earth for some reason. One of the more interesting XK class scenarios, and very, very interesting execution with various segments of social media parts inserted into SCP-4991, and it is very visually appealing because of that. Someone to watch over us. One of the most wholesome SCPs. It makes sure that nobody has to die alone. Even though you think of yourself as insignificant, SCP-4999 will come to you and try to calm you down and be there at your last minutes on Earth. SCP-5000, it's S tier. Though the core anomaly, the broken suit, could be expanded upon more. It just says in the description that it is a broken suit built by the Foundation from essentially an alternative timeline, but that isn't even the core idea, the core focus of SCP-5000. The core focus of SCP-5000, it's a story, and I genuinely got a little bit emotional while I was reading this, and none of the other SCPs have really achieved that, except for, where is it? Where are they? It was SCP-1522, the ships that sail through the night. Anyways, those were the two SCPs which I got really emotional. SCP-5000, because I'm a fanboy for SCP, I just got really emotional. It's nice to see a story where the SCP Foundation is simply portrayed as evil. a story concept which has never been executed before from my knowledge, and it's executed so fairly well. How the SCP, I especially love the logs where the SCP Foundation simply releases the SCPs one by one, trying to destroy humanity. I love the mystery surrounding it. I love how you have to pick up the various dots and piece them together. SCP-5000, definitely one of the best SCPs ever written. One of the most memorable SCPs ever written. And I could talk about SCP-5000 for hours on end, but I have to go on. And it's the last SCP. SCP-8900-Explained. So, everybody had that moment in their childhood where they looked upon a gray, white, and black photo and thought, wow, the world looked pretty different back then. And some of us thought that colors were later invented. But no, that's not how reality works. But this SCP explains that it is actually like that. The world was black and white, but then some phenomena caused to implement colors into reality, and now the Foundation and reality has to live with that, has to deal with that fact. And it's a good explained SCP. Even though it's technically not explained, they just have to deal with it because it has become common sense, common knowledge that colors exist, that colors are natural things, even though they come from some anomalous source. So, this will be it. My entire SCP tier list. Maybe I will arrange some stuff later on, like those who are more on the top to more on the left are better than those who are more on the bottom and more on the right. Maybe I could do something like that, but no, I'm going to leave it like that. I hope you enjoyed this lengthy SCP tier list, which I finally finished. So, have a nice day, wherever you are. Goodbye.